By the second midnight of the Ironmouth storm, Crow Ash Ranch had stopped looking like a ranch. It was just darkness, snow, and one braided rawhide line disappearing into white. The wind crossed the basin hard enough to flatten breath against a man's teeth. The thermometer nailed beside the kitchen door had fallen to 31 below. Fence rails were buried. The yard vanished. Even the barn lanterns looked less like lights than small red wounds in the storm. At the far edge of the cattle shed, the cedar baffle had torn loose. Not the whole thing, just one slatted wing. But if that wing failed, the wind would strike the shed door sideways, pack the entry with snow, and seal 27 head of cattle inside before daylight. Tomas Vale tied the rawhide line around his ribs. Rhea Sutter took the other end with both hands. Inside the house, 9-year-old Will counted the red lanterns through the whiteout, so he would know if his father was still moving. Behind the quilt curtain, little Annie cried herself hoarse. In the shed, a young heifer strained in a calving stall. And Gideon Cross, the hired man who had called Tomas a charity case 6 weeks earlier, lay half-conscious beside the stove, with frost burned into his cheeks. The line jerked once, then twice, then it went still. 6 weeks before that night, Tomas had arrived at Crow Ash with no horse, no wages, and no plan beyond one sentence: milk for my children. So how did the survival of Rhea Sutter's whole ranch come down to whether he could crawl through a blizzard and keep one broken wall from becoming a door for the wind? In late October of 1892, Tomas Vale came over the south ridge of Crow Ash Basin, pulling a 2-wheeled flour cart that had already lost one spoke. He was 38. He looked 10 years older. His right boot had been patched with rawhide. His coat had 2 different sleeves, one wool and one canvas. A faded tool roll hung from the cart handle. In the cart, tucked between a skillet, 3 blankets, and a sack of oats, slept 11-month-old Annie. Will walked beside the wheel without asking when they would stop. That was how Tomas knew the boy had changed. A hungry child asks. A frightened child asks quietly. But a child who has stopped believing answers are useful says nothing at all. Tomas had once worked repair crews along the stage road between Fort Benton and the rail towns. He fixed smoke boxes, wagon springs, pump rods, barn doors, threshing belts, and whatever else had broken in places too remote to wait for a proper mechanic. Then his wife, Eliza, died of fever after Annie was born. No crew foreman wanted a widower dragging 2 children from camp to camp. 3 ranches had already refused him. One said he could sleep in the bunkhouse if the children stayed in town. One offered 2 meals and pointed him back to the road. The last one suggested a baby girl could always be placed with a family that had room. Tomas thanked them, picked Annie up, and walked until the last light left the sage. By the time Crow Ash Ranch appeared below them, Annie's mouth was moving against the blanket because there was nothing left to suck. Will had half a biscuit hidden in his shirt, not because he was selfish, but because he no longer trusted morning to bring food. Crow Ash looked better than nothing, but not by much. The cattle shed sat too square to the northwest. Its wide door opened toward the worst weather in the basin. The hay was stacked in one heavy mound directly on cold earth. A cracked pump house leaned over the well like a drunk man over a barrel. The old poplar windrow had grown tall, thin, and useless, close enough to the shed to make snow pile exactly where snow should never pile. But smoke came from the chimney, and in the lower pen, dairy cows were still on their feet. Rhea Sutter stood beside the trough, chopping ice with a mattock, while a feed ledger was tucked beneath one arm. She was 35, maybe 36, with a weather-browned face and black hair pinned in a knot that had come half loose in the wind. Her sleeves were rolled up. One glove was missing. Nothing about her looked soft. Nothing about her looked helpless. She watched the man, the boy, and the cart for a long moment. Then she asked, "What can you fix?" Tomas did not begin with sorrow. He had learned that grief did not buy bread. Doors, pumps, roof braces, troughs, harness snaps, frozen valves, hay racks, smoke leaks, wagons if the axle wasn't split clean through. Rhea looked at the cart. "And what are you asking for?" Tomas lifted Annie against his shoulder. The little girl did not cry. That made it worse. Milk for her, food for the boy. A place out of the wind tonight. Rhea waited. Tomas looked past her at the ranch buildings. "And after that, I'll fix the things winter is already aiming at." Her eyes narrowed. "Winter hasn't arrived." "It has. You're just still calling it weather." That was the first time Rhea truly looked at him. Tomas pointed toward the cattle shed. "That door takes the northwest wind square in the mouth. The hay's sweating from the ground. Your pump spout will freeze where the pipe leaves the wall. And that poplar row is not a windbreak anymore. It's a snow trap with branches." Silence opened between them. On the frontier, men sold confidence the way peddlers sold tonic. Proof was rarer. Rhea stepped forward, not toward Tomas, but toward Annie. "Give her to me." Tomas hesitated, only because his hands did not know how to let go anymore. Rhea took the baby with care, touched 2 fingers to her cheek, and turned toward the house. The milk comes before the argument. Inside, the kitchen smelled of ash, boiled coffee, and last night's beans. Rhea warmed fresh cow's milk with water, cooled it against the inside of her wrist, then handed the cup to Tomas. Slow. Will sat stiffly at the table, as if a wrong movement might cost him the meal. Rhea placed stew in front of him, then cornbread, then a small dish of dried choke cherries. He ate without looking up. Before he finished, he slipped 1 piece of cornbread into his pocket. Rhea saw it. Tomas saw her see it. Neither of them spoke. She simply set another piece beside his bowl. Not as charity, not as pity. As if the bread had always belonged there. That night, Tomas told her only what was necessary. Eliza had died in April. Will had not slept through a night since. Annie could still not keep heavy food down. Rhea told him less, but enough. Her husband, Abel Sutter, had been crushed 3 winters earlier under a logging sled near Juniper Pass. He had built Crow Ash with his own hands and too much faith in straight lines. The ranch still owed money for 2 lost winters. She had no children. She had no brother coming. And the biggest rancher in the basin, Mercer Dodd, had been waiting for her to fail since the funeral. Later, Rhea opened a small storeroom beside the kitchen. Inside was a low cradle, half-finished, its pine rail rubbed smooth on one side and rough on the other. "Abel started it," she said. Tomas did not ask why she had kept it. Some things were not kept because they were useful. They were kept because burning them would admit too much. Annie slept in that cradle. Will slept in the corner with one hand closed around the hidden cornbread in his pocket. And before dawn, Tomas was outside, not hammering, not building, watching. He tied wool threads to the cattle shed hinges and watched the wind pull them inward. He dug beneath the hay and found damp, sour heat in the bottom forkfuls. He poured a bucket into the trough and counted how long the water sat before draining. He held his palm near the kitchen wall and felt a thin draft cut through old chinking. He walked to the poplars and studied the long, hardened snow ridges from the year before. Rhea followed him with a lantern, but said nothing. At last, Tomas pointed to the shed. The building isn't failing because it's old. It's failing because the wind has a straight road. He knelt beside the hay. This will rot from the bottom, then heat, then spoil the good feed above it. He tapped the pump spout. This pipe is alive underground and dead in the open air. That little exposed section will freeze first. Then he faced the poplar row. Your husband planted those for spring. Rhea's jaw tightened. Abel planted them to protect the barn. And he did, Tomas said. From the wrong season. She looked at him. He did not soften it. Spring wind leans different. Winter wind comes lower, heavier, and meaner. Trees that help one season can betray another. For the first time, Rhea's anger had no easy place to land. Tomas drew a line in the frost with his boot. Water first, then hay. Then a slatted baffle, not a solid wall. Then a bent entry so the wind can't drive straight into the shed. Marker posts from house to barn before the first whiteout. How long? 5 weeks, if we don't waste money. Rhea folded her arms. You get 6 days, she said. After that, I decide whether you see trouble or just need a place to stand. Tomas nodded. 6 days is more than I had yesterday. He began where pride would not get in the way. Hay. He, Rhea, and Will pulled the bottom layers apart. Sour steam lifted from the mound. The underside was warm in patches and blackening where it had trapped moisture against the ground. Tomas built a raised rack from old fence rails, 10 inches off the earth. Not elegant, not pretty, strong enough. Instead of one grand stack, he made 3 narrower cribs with hand-width air channels between them. Will's job was to measure every gap with a broken axe handle. 10 inches, Tomas told him. The boy checked each opening, counted under his breath, then louder. By noon, he had spoken more words than he had in 3 days. Next came the pump. Tomas opened a narrow trench and found the line barely 2.5 feet down. The ground there froze deeper in a hard winter. Rhea stood over the trench with a lantern. We can't dig all of it before snow. Then we don't. He pointed from the well to the cattle trough. We protect the part that keeps milk alive. No speech, no pride. Just a smaller battle worth winning. On the 4th day, Mercer Dodd rode in with 2 men behind him and a smile that belonged in warmer weather. Mercer owned the freight road, most of the lower hay ground, and enough cattle to call losses weather instead of ruin. After Abel died, he had offered to buy crow ash for half its value. Rhea had refused him in front of his own men, He had been polite ever since. Polite in the way a wolf is quiet before it finds the gap in a fence. Mercer looked at the raised hay, the trench, and the first cedar stakes Tomas had set 39 feet upwind from the shed. "That your new hired prophet?"
Rhea did not answer.
Mercer nudged one stake with his boot. "Put a wall there, and you'll make a drift big enough to bury your own cattle." "If it's tight," Tomas said. Mercer's smile faded a little. Tomas lifted a cedar slat. "A wall fights the wind. A baffle bleeds it." Mercer turned to Rhea. "You are letting a road beggar redesign your winter?" Rhea looked at the stake line, not at Mercer. "He is my repair foreman until the work proves him a fool." The words surprised Tomas so sharply, he almost dropped the slat. Mercer laughed once. "Winter will prove all of us." He pulled his reins. "And when the county road closes, remember who owns the lower passage." After he rode out, Will stared after him. "What if he's right?" Tomas set the next cedar post. "Then we learn before the blizzard does." The first lesson came fast. A dry squall hit Crow Ash 2 days later, throwing loose snow out of the gullies, though the main storm was still weeks away. Tomas had tied cloth tails along the cedar frame. Within minutes, the middle section snapped tight. The baffle was too dense. Wind struck it, climbed, rolled, and dropped on the leeward side like a thrown blanket. Snow began crawling toward the shed door. Mercer's 2 riders had stopped on the ridge to watch. Tomas did not defend the mistake. He cut every 4th slat from the center. Rhea studied the cloth strips whipping in the gusts. "Angle the next ones," she said. Tomas looked over. "Why?" "Flat things dare the wind. Angled things send it somewhere else." He almost smiled.
Abel teach you that?
"My father. Sheep sheds near Beartooth Creek." They rebuilt the center at a diagonal, wide enough to breathe. When the next gust passed through, the cedar trembled, the wind broke, and the snow settled in a low ridge far short of the door. Tomas touched one fluttering cloth strip. "A good baffle doesn't win against the wind." Rhea finished the thought. "It makes the wind spend itself early." The bent entry failed, too. The turn was too narrow. A brindle cow balked at the dark angle and nearly tore down the gate. Rhea took one look and pulled the hinge pins herself. "We widen it." They moved the gate, hung a tin lantern in the corner, and opened the turn until the cow passed through without fear. At dusk, Rhea handed Tomas the hammer. "Your angles."
She looked at the lantern.
"My cow."
Then she nodded toward the work.
"Both need sense."
The county stock inspector arrived the following week. His name was Orrin Hale, and he had the face of a man who trusted records more than stories. He did not mock Thomas. That almost made him harder. He checked the hay rack with his hand. He smelled the bedding. He measured the stove distance from the hanging quilt. He studied the pipe where it crossed from earth to air. "A warmer shed can trap sickness if it stays wet," Hale said. "Deep straw can sour. A closed doorway can keep wind out and bad air in. And that exposed spout will freeze first." Thomas nodded. "I saw the same risk." "Seeing it isn't fixing it." "No." Hale looked at Rhea. "Keep numbers for 3 weeks. Morning temperature, evening temperature, how much wood you burn, how much hay goes out. bedding moisture, milk yield, and every time you break ice. Rhea hung Abel's old account ledger beside the kitchen door. Then she placed the pencil in Will's hand. Write clear. The boy did. From that morning on, Croash stopped arguing by opinion. It began arguing by evidence. But evidence had a cruel habit. It did not flatter the builder. The first chinking mix failed. Tomas had used too much clay. After 2 nights, the new seams shrank from the logs, and the wool strip near Annie's cradle fluttered in a draught. He reached for the scraper. Rhea stopped him. Less clay, more hair. Rye straw if you cut it short. Scratch the first coat before the second, or it has nothing to hold. Tomas turned.
You've done this? I lived in houses before I owned one. That was all she said. They remixed it her way. This time, the mortar gripped. Later, while clearing the storeroom for dry kindling, Tomas found an old wagon canvas with careful stitching along one edge. His hand stopped on the seam. Eliza sewed this. Rhea looked at him. We used it in a repair camp. Kept drafts off Will when he was small. He started to measure the cloth with a knife. You don't have to cut it, Rhea said. So they hung the whole canvas between the sleeping corner and the stove room, stitch and all. That night, the children's side of the room kept its heat. Tomas stood there longer than he meant to, one hand on the seam his wife had made. Then he stepped back. He did not let go of Eliza all at once. No one does. But for the first time, memory had become shelter instead of only weight. The house changed quietly after that, not by promise, by repetition. Rhea learned Annie's cries. Hunger had one sound, cold had another. The cry that came after nightmare was smaller, almost embarrassed. At first, Rhea held the baby too stiffly, as if affection required training. Then Annie began reaching for the collar of her coat whenever she crossed the room. Will stopped hiding every bite, not all at once. First, he hid bread and forgot it. Then he left it in plain sight. Then, one morning, the cornbread remained on the table until breakfast, untouched. Tomas saw it and said nothing. A child does not announce the return of trust. He simply sleeps without guarding tomorrow. One evening, Will sat shelling beans while Rhea repaired a torn harness strap. Why didn't you have any children? He asked. Tomas, by the stove, went still. Rhea kept stitching. Some doors are built into rooms that never get used. Will looked toward the cradle where Annie slept with one hand open. That room got used now. Rhea pushed the needle through leather. Yes, she said softly. I suppose it did. The first true cold snap arrived before the main storm. By sunrise, the yard sat at 14 above zero. The old cattle shed used to fall into the low 20s, even with the animals inside. That morning, behind the cedar baffle and bent entry, it held at 32. The bedding stayed dry. The hay rack smelled clean. The house burned 5 armloads of wood instead of nearly 8. The numbers were beginning to speak. Then the trough stopped running. Not underground. At the exposed iron elbow. Orrin Hale had been right. The pipe froze exactly where it left protection and met the air. Tomas broke the ice with a hatchet, jaw tight. I missed it. Rhea brought a lantern lower. You didn't miss it. You left it for later. That's another way to freeze cattle. Together they lowered the drain, boxed the elbow in scrap pine, packed dry wool waste around it, left in air gaps so wet warmth would not rot the wrap, and covered the box with tarred canvas. They worked until their hands shook. Near midnight, Rhea came back from the kitchen with 2 tin cups of chicory coffee. Tomas took one without looking at her. I said I could fix this place. You are. The water froze. Rhea blew steam from her cup. You promised to fix what Winter would break. You never promised to be Winter's twin brother. He looked at her then. Meaning? Meaning, Winter knows everything at once. People learn one mistake at a time. The next morning the trough filled, the cows drank, and the line drained clean before the cold could take hold. For the first time since he had arrived, Tomas understood how Rhea was measuring him, not by whether he guessed right, by whether he stayed until the failure had no place left to stand. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled. Morning temperature, evening temperature, wood used, hay fed, milk taken, ice broken, bedding checked. Will's numbers grew neater, Rhea's notes grew sharper. Tomas added small marks beside every change, not to brag, but to remember what had actually caused what. By the end of the 3rd week, the ranch had its own argument. 2 and sometimes 3 fewer armloads of wood on hard days. Hay use down by nearly a 1/5. Milk steady. No ice in the trough after the elbow box was rebuilt. Orrin Hale returned, read the ledger, and closed it without smiling. I would not call this proven. Tomas nodded. Hale tapped the cover. But I would call it working. That afternoon, Mercer Dodd rode in again. This time he did not bother with jokes. The lower passage closes when real snow comes, unless Crow Ash signs over spring water use through March. Rhea's face did not move. No. Mercer looked toward Tomas. You've been here long enough to make her stubborn expensive. Tomas said nothing. Mercer leaned in the saddle. A few cold mornings aren't winter. After he left, Tomas opened the ledger. How much feed if his road closes? By last year's use, Rhea said. 18 days. And by these numbers? 23, maybe 24. Tomas studied the sky. We prepare for 28. Rhea wrote the number on the next clean line. 28. Then she drew one straight mark beneath it. That was the moment the ranch stopped preparing for inconvenience. It began preparing for siege. 3 days before the Ironmouth storm, the basin changed. Juniper cows turned their backs to the northwest and refused open graze. The air grew heavy enough to feel handled. Low clouds lay against the horizon in bands, gray and flat. At dusk, the wind stopped so completely that every hinge in the ranch seemed to be holding its breath. Tomas and Rhea quit improving things. Now they only secured them. Marker poles went into the ground every 16 feet between house, shed, pump, and hay rack. Each pole carried a red cloth strip that could be seen in a whiteout if a man was close enough to deserve saving. The cistern was filled. The hay was moved closer without closing its air channels. Spare cedar slats were tied under the shed eaves. A repair sack waited by the door with wire, rawhide, wedges, a mallet, a hand auger, and a short brace board. A guideline ran from the kitchen rail to the cattle shed and back to the pump box. Will watched Thomas knot the line. "Why use poles if we have rope?" Thomas pulled the knot tight. "A rope keeps you from leaving the path." He looked toward the red strips. "Poles tell you the path still exists." In the tool shed, Rhea found one of Abel's old survey stakes, his cut mark still visible at the top. She carried it to the first post by the kitchen door. Thomas said nothing. He reinforced the repair sack with the stitched edge of Eliza's worn harness strap. Rhea saw it. She said nothing either. By then, silence between them had changed. It no longer meant absence. Sometimes it meant respect. Near dark, Orrin Hale's rider brought a written warning from the county seat. Arctic air had dropped from the north. Winds could pass 58 miles an hour. No travel after snowfall began. No open range recovery until the blow broke. Rhea read it once. Tomas read it once. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into the ledger. The storm arrived before dawn. The first blast struck from the northwest, exactly where the baffle waited. The cedar wing bent but did not break. Snow built on the far side in a long, ugly ridge away from the shed door. The bent entry took the force out of the wind before it reached the cattle. The trough filled, then drained. The pump elbow stayed wrapped and alive. Behind Eliza's canvas curtain, the children's corner held enough warmth that Annie slept between cries. Tomas and Rhea moved between house and shed, one at a time, clipped to the rawhide guideline. By midday, one marker pole disappeared to its top. The next one still showed red. Late in the afternoon, a shape moved beyond the second pole. At first, Tomas thought it was brush. Then it fell. He clipped himself to the line and followed the posts into the white. At the edge of the baffle, he found Gideon Cross, half buried in drifted snow, one glove gone, one cheek pale as tallow. His horse was missing. His lips were cracked open. "I saw red," Gideon whispered. That was all. Tomas dragged him back to the house. The same man who had laughed at the cedar wall now lived because a red cloth strip had told him where ground still existed. When Gideon woke beside the stove, he spoke through shaking teeth. "Mercer's north shed is open. Roof split at the corner. Cattle packed against the boards. No water." No one answered. Not because they did not care, because the storm had not finished asking for payment. Before sunrise on the second day, Rhea heard the wrong sound from the cattle shed. A low, broken bellow. She knew it before she saw the heifer. Bramble, one of the younger milk cows, had gone into labor too early. The calf was turned wrong. The veterinarian could not come. No road existed. No neighbor could cross. The only help in the world was already inside the reach of the guideline. Rhea washed her hands in warm water. Tomas boiled the calving straps. Will held the lantern, his knuckles white around the handle. Rhea tied the tail aside, set her jaw, and worked carefully. Not fast, not dramatic. Carefully. The way an old range woman had shown her when Abel was still alive and she was still treated like an extra pair of hands instead of the owner of a ranch. "Look at Bramble's eyes," she told Will. He swallowed. "Not at me. Not at the blood. Her eyes." He obeyed. Tomas returned from checking the pump just as the final pull came. The calf slid onto the straw and lay still. Rhea cleared the mouth. Tomas rubbed the ribs with dry straw. Will dropped the lantern lower, then caught himself and lifted it again. Nothing. Then the calf's chest jumped. One breath, then another. The shed became very quiet, though the storm was still tearing at the walls. The dry bedding kept the newborn from freezing against the floor. The bent entry kept wind from knifing through the stall. The live water made clean hands possible. The lantern in the widened corner kept the cattle from crowding the heifer. Nothing that saved the calf looked heroic by itself. A box around a pipe, a better turn in a gate, a raised floor of straw, a child holding light steady. But survival often comes that way, not as one grand act, as small things fixed before the worst day knows their names. By the third day, the storm had become something less like weather and more like an animal trying every corner of the ranch with its teeth. Just after noon, the north wing of the cedar baffle cracked. One lashing snapped, then another. The loose slats beat against the frame. If that wing tore away, the wind would pour through the broken gap, strike the bent entry from the wrong angle, and fill it with snow. The cattle would not freeze first. They would be trapped first. That was worse. Tomas reached for the repair sack. Rhea caught the rawhide line and wrapped it once around the kitchen post, then around her forearm. 3 pulls for line, he said. I know. 2 to pull back. I know. He looked at her then, through the open door and the storm between them. She did not blink. Tomas crawled from pole to pole. He could not walk. Walking made a man tall enough for the wind to own him. He kept one shoulder low and one hand on the line. Snow filled his collar. Ice cut along his eyelids. At the broken wing, the cedar lattice slammed into him hard enough to knock the breath from his chest. The repair sack flew open. Wire, wedges, and the small mallet scattered across the drift. Only Eliza's old strap held the sack from vanishing. Inside the house, Rhea felt the line jerk once, then nothing. Will stood near the window with Annie in his arms. Ma'am? Rhea did not turn. Count red. I can't see him. Count anyway. In the whiteout, Tomas found one wedge by touch and the braceboard by luck. The baffle did not need rebuilding. It only needed to stop failing until the storm grew tired. He drove the board across the broken wing, lashed it with wire, and jammed a spare cedar slat through the frame to give the wind something crooked to spend itself against. Then he pulled the line 3 times. Rhea fed him slack. He tied the final knot blind. By the time she felt 2 pulls, her hands had gone numb around the rope. She hauled, slowly. The line fought back with dead weight, then living weight. A shape crawled out of the white and collapsed against the doorframe. Tomas had snow in his beard and blood at one temple. He lifted one hand before she could speak. It'll hold until morning. Rhea looked past him toward the invisible wall. Then morning is enough. By the 4th morning, the wind fell from rage to warning. No one cheered. They counted. Every Maine animal alive. Bramble's calf alive, with one frost-bitten ear tip. Water flowing, hay dry, bedding clean. Shed door open without digging. Cistern covered. 2 marker poles leaning. 1 cedar wing cracked and ugly, but still standing. Gideon Cross on his feet, shaking but alive. Tomas walked the yard with a notebook instead of relief.
1 wing needed a heavier diagonal brace. 2 poles had been set too shallow. The cloth strips needed double stitching. The pump box roof would shed snow better if it sloped east. The entry lantern needed a second hook in case the first failed. Rhea watched him write. You count the wounds before the living. Tomas closed the notebook. The living can speak for themselves. He looked at the battered baffle. A weakness hides best behind success. That line stayed with Rhea. Later, under a low gray sky, steam rose from the cattle as they stood in the cold. Rhea said, The children have milk. Tomas looked toward the shed. The ranch still needs work. She handed him 1 tin cup and kept the other. Good. He glanced over. She looked at the broken cedar wall. You said you stay where the work is. When the roads opened, people came to Crow Ash for answers before they came with apologies. Orrin Hale arrived first, then the veterinarian, then ranchers from the lower basin who had spent 4 days chopping animals from drifted snow and carrying water in frozen buckets. Hale checked the shed temperature. He pressed his bare hand into the bedding. He measured the snow ridge beyond the baffle. He watched the trough fill and drain. He read the ledger from the first cold snap to the last mark made during the storm. At last, he shut the book. The shed stayed drier. Feed lasted longer. The herd kept drinking. The snow laid down where you invited it, not where it could lock the door. He looked at Tomas. And the failures you found early were smaller than the failures the storm would have found late. Gideon Cross stood near the stove, wrapped in a quilt. I'd be dead if the red posts hadn't been there. Nobody made him say it louder. Mercer Dodd came in the afternoon. His north shed had lost roof boards. His cattle losses were not ruinous, but they were not small enough to hide. He dismounted near the cedar baffle and looked at the broken wing for a long time. How far? Tomas knew what he meant. 39 feet from the door at center. Farther where the ground dips. And the slats? Never tight. If the wind can't pass, it climbs. If it climbs, it drops. Mercer touched 1 diagonal brace. Show me. Rhea expected Tomas to refuse. He did not. He walked Mercer through the snow and explained the thing plainly, without revenge. That may have been the first moment Rhea understood the difference between pride and authority. Pride makes a secret out of knowledge. Authority uses it where it keeps something alive. That evening, after the last rider left, Rhea asked Tomas into the small ranch office. She placed a folded agreement on the desk. It named him Repair Foreman of Crow Ash Ranch, with authority over water, winter works, structural repairs, and storm preparation. It granted him a share of the ranch's profit once the debt was met. The last line stood apart from the rest. Will and Annie Vale would have a permanent home at Crow Ash Ranch, regardless of any arrangement between Rhea Sutter and Tomas Vale. Tomas read that line twice. Why put that in writing? Because hunger believes paper more than promises. His throat moved.
Why give me part of what Abel built? Rhea did not look away. I'm not giving you Abel's place. She turned the agreement toward him. I'm naming the work you already carried. He signed, not quickly, not dramatically, carefully, as if the act itself might break if handled too hard. That night, the ranch was quiet in a way it had not been since Tomas arrived. Will slept without bread in his pocket. Annie slept in Abel's unfinished cradle behind Eliza's canvas curtain. Rhea and Tomas sat near the stove with 2 tin cups between them. At last, Tomas said, I came here asking for milk. Rhea watched the fire. You asked for enough to keep them alive, and you gave more. No, she said. I gave what was in the house. He looked at her. She finally turned. You gave what could keep the house standing. The silence after that was not empty. Tomas set his cup down. I can stay until spring repairs are done. Rhea's mouth almost smiled. Spring repairs become summer repairs. Then summer. Hay season comes after that. Then hay. And winter comes back. He looked toward the window, where ice still clung to the lower glass. Then I suppose I better learn the place properly. Rhea lifted her cup. You already started. They did not marry when the roads opened. Work came first. The broken baffle was rebuilt with deeper posts and better diagonals. The pump box got a sloped roof. The marker poles were reset. The hay racks were copied by 3 neighboring ranches before March ended. Even Mercer Dodd built a cedar baffle outside his north shed, though he claimed he had been considering the idea for years. Orrin Hale began recommending the Crow Ash winter ledger to ranches across the basin, not as miracle, as method. In May, when grass returned in thin green stitches across the yard, Tomas and Rhea married in the kitchen. Orrin Hale signed as witness. The veterinarian signed under him. Mercer did not attend, but a load of straight cedar posts appeared beside the fence before sunrise, tied with good rope and no note. Afterward, Will stood by the ledger, twisting the pencil in his hand. Do I call you something else now? Rhea knelt to his height. Not unless the word is true. He nodded. Rhea. Her eyes softened. That is true enough. 3 weeks later, he tripped near the marker poles and shouted, Ma! Then stopped himself so suddenly his face went red. Rhea brushed dirt from his hands and pretended not to hear the unfinished word. But she kept that moment as carefully as she had kept Abel's cradle. In June, Annie took her first unsteady steps from the kitchen door toward Rhea, one hand lifted in the air. Ma, she said. The yard went still. Rhea did not rush forward. She knelt in the dust and let the child finish the distance on her own. Tomas stood near the repaired cedar baffle, watching the open shed door, the clean hay racks, the red marker poles stacked for next winter, and the cattle grazing beyond them. It still needs fixing, he said. Rhea lifted Annie into her arms and looked back at him. That's why you stayed. Crow Ash did not survive because the winter became kind. It survived because no one there mistook loneliness for strength, and because every weakness they were brave enough to see was one less thing the storm could use against them.